Welcome to your lecture on learning and memory. This lecture is divided into two parts. In the first part, we're going to consider types of learning, types of memory, the stimulus response processes of learning, focusing specifically on classical and operant conditioning, motor learning, focusing on the cortex and the basal ganglia, and perceptual learning. We will first discuss the types of learning and types of memory. Before we do so, I want to draw your attention to the number of really useful videos provided by the textbook publisher Pearson. So learning is about the acquisition of new information. It's the process by which experiences change the nervous system and consequently behavior. Long-term changes in the nervous system subsequent to learning are represented in the form of memories. And it's important to note that an information processing model of memory is particularly helpful for thinking about learning. There are four basic forms of learning: stimulus response learning, motor learning, perceptual learning, and relational learning. The four major steps in learning and memory include encoding, memory consolidation, storage, and retrieval. With stimulus response learning, we have the ability to learn to perform a particular behavior when a particular stimulus is present. This has the tendency to establish connections between circuits that are involved in perception and movement. It includes two categories of learning, including classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Stimulus response learning, as I mentioned before, includes classical conditioning. This involves an association between two stimuli. When an unconditioned stimulus, the US, causes an unconditioned response, the UR, enough times, it becomes the conditioned stimulus, and we know this because it's able to elicit the conditioned response, CR. The image here shows a man with headgear that has electrodes connected to a computer that records movements of eye muscles. In this illustration, an air jet tube from the headgear sends a puff of air to the eye. An audio speaker is shown beside the man's image. The steps show classical conditioning as follows. Headgear is arranged for eye blink conditioning. Puff of air to the eye causes eye blink. After pairing air puff with tone, tone comes to elicit eye blink on its own as evidence of classical conditioning. So here you see a schematogram of the process described in the previous slide. A puff of air is shown to be applied to the neuron of the somatosensory system in the eye, followed by a tone to the neuron in the auditory system. The reaction after the puff of air in the somatosensory synapse is strong, whereas the reaction in the auditory synapse after a tone is weak. Both produce a response, a blink in the motor neuron. And over time, the activation of that auditory synapse comes to take on the properties of signaling the puff of air, and we find that it becomes a conditioned stimulus causing eye blink. You're probably more familiar with the Skinner box, which you will recall from your introductory psychology courses. The stimulus response learning process includes operant conditioning, where a reinforcing or a punishing outcome follows a specific behavior in specific situations, resulting in either the increase or the decrease of that behavior. In this illustration, you can see a comparison and contrast of classical conditioning with operant conditioning. The differences between them come down to the fact that operant conditioning permits changes to behavior according to the behavioral consequences. And that means the reinforcing stimulus or the punishing stimulus. In another distinction, it's important to note that classical conditioning is involuntary, sometimes reflexive. Operant conditioning is voluntary and learned. Also, it's important to note that with classical conditioning, there is an association between typically two stimuli, so a tone and a puff of air. And classical conditioning tends to map onto ecologically valid sort of learning paradigms, whereas operant conditioning involves an association between a stimulus and the response. So what you do to get a job, or how effectively you work at your job may result in the amount of pay. So these complex contingencies based on reward or punishment reinforce or decrease the likelihood of certain behaviors. This simple model, this neural model of operant conditioning from your textbook, shows the following actions in a series. There's the perceptual system depicted as well as the motor system. You'll see that the perceptual system involves a stimulus, for example, the sight of a lever, that leads to neural circuits and the detection of that particular stimulus. The motor system involves some components of the reinforcement mechanisms that strengthen connections leading to neural circuits operating that control a particular behavior, causing the reaction, for example, the lever press in response to the delivery of food in the case of a rat. So here the reinforcing stimulus is the food. It leads to reinforcement of certain motor mechanisms that can repeat in a cyclical fashion. Some stimuli lead to perceptual learning as part of a perceptual system, which causes changes in the neural circuits that detect the particular stimulus, give rise to motor learning or the motor system's activation, causing changes in the neural circuits that control a particular behavior. This illustration also shows the connection between stimulus response learning occurring between perceptual and motor learning, and the final result based on this schematogram is the response. So it's important to note that motor learning establishes or supports changes within the motor system following a stimulus. This requires guidance from the environment. Perceptual learning speaks to the ability to learn to recognize stimuli that have been perceived before. A primary function of this is to identify and categorize objects and situations. It's accomplished primarily by changes in the sensory association cortex for each sensory system. Relational learning has to do with the relationships among individual stimuli, so the relative locations of objects. Episodic learning involves remembering sequences of events that we witness, for instance, as part of this relational learning paradigm. As you can see from this illustration, sensory input enters the sensory memory system, and any unattended information is lost. With attention, sensory memory leads to short-term memory activation, and maintenance rehearsal keeps the information there. Unrehearsed information is lost. Then the information makes its way into long-term memory through the process of encoding, and from there, retrieval leads back to short-term memory. From long-term memory, some information may be lost through deterioration over time. So it's important to note that short-term memory contains information from sensory memory only if it's meaningful or salient enough. The length of short-term memory ranges from seconds to minutes, and its capacity is limited to a few items. And so rehearsal is how we increase the length, and chunking is how we increase the capacity of short-term memory. So with long-term memory, this contains information from short-term memory that is consolidated. It's relatively permanent in comparison to short-term memory, but really it lasts from minutes to hours to days, even decades. This, of course, is strengthened with increased retrieval. This table from your textbook compares and contrasts declarative and non-declarative memory tasks. So with declarative memory, this is also called explicit memory. The memory of events and facts we can think of and talk about that's not simply verbal, but maybe like a video, is what we're talking about. This includes episodic memories, providing context, as well as some semantic memories, including facts. With non-declarative memory, we are talking about implicit memory. This includes memories that we're not necessarily conscious of. So things from, for instance, the pre-verbal stages of your childhood, to the extent that you can remember these. It operates automatically and controls motor behaviors, such as, for instance, riding a bike, throwing a ball, and dancing. So human memory is made up of three kinds of memory. There's sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, and they vary in terms of the time span. Within long-term memory, there's declarative memory that has to do with facts and events, and non-declarative memory that has to do with skills and tasks. Within declarative memory, we have episodic memory and semantic memory. And episodic memories involve events and experiences, whereas semantic memories pertain to facts and concepts. So now on to a discussion of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If you have a pet or grew up on a farm, you probably have witnessed classical conditioning in operation. This has to do with shaping an animal's behavior based on specific stimuli, things that come to signal almost arbitrarily, in some instances, the impending arrival of food, or shapes an animal's staying within the confines of a particular range. More specifically, classical conditioning involves neurological functions such as activation of the amygdala, where an aversive stimulus produces a variety of behavioral and autonomic and hormonal responses associated with information about the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, which converge in the lateral nucleus of the amygdala. The somatosensory input from the amygdala activates strong synapses in the lateral nucleus. Long-term potentiation is associated with the activation of NMDA receptors and AMPA receptors as described in your textbook. In contrast to the microscopic properties of NMDA and AMPA, the macroscopic functions involved with conditioning include a number of brain areas that regulate our stimulus and response pathway. They include the primary motor cortex, the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nuclei, and the substantia nigra. These pathways are important in a number of behavioral functions, as you probably know. Information from the transcortical pathway is transferred to the basal ganglia as the behavior becomes automatic in the case of conditioning. The caudate and putamen receive information from the frontal lobes about movements. That information then goes to the globus pallidus and eventually to the premotor and supplementary motor cortex. Finally, it goes to the primary motor cortex where the response behavior is initiated. I want to say a couple of things about the basal ganglia's role. So the basal ganglia, as you will probably recall, is involved with movement. It's invoked in disorders like Parkinson's, where there are problems with dopamine neurotransmission. This circuit's responsible for operant conditioning, beginning in the sensory cortex where we have perception and ending in the motor association cortex where we have movement. There are two major pathways, the direct transcortical connections and then also the connections through the basal ganglia and the thalamus. The basal ganglia has many notable connections that are involved in the processing of learning and memory. First, from this illustration, you can see that the neostriatum consists of the caudate, the putamen, and this receives sensory information from all regions of the cerebral cortex, the primary motor cortex, and the primary somatosensory cortex. These are shown in the illustration as excitatory connections. The outputs of the caudate nucleus and the putamen are sent to the globus pallidus, and those function as inhibitory connections. The subthalamic nucleus receives inhibitory connection from the globus pallidus and sends outputs that are excitatory to the globus pallidus's internal component. The outputs of the globus pallidus's internal component are then sent to the frontal cortex, to the premotor and supplementary motor cortex through the VA and VL of the thalamus. So just in summary, the transcortical pathways are involved in acquiring episodic memories and complex behaviors that involve deliberation or instruction. For instance, a memorized set of rules that can function as a script one might follow. The basal ganglia pathways involve learned behaviors becoming automatic and routine. They are transferred to the basal ganglia. This frees up the transcortical circuits. There's no longer a need to deliberately think through each step. Here is a coronal section or a cross section of the ventral tegmental area in the rat. Some of the structures shown include the septal area, the corpus callosum, the basal ganglia, the nucleus accumbens, and the anterior commissure. You can also see on the right-hand side the substantia nigra, the hippocampal formation, and specifically the ventral tegmental area. So reinforcement the nucleus accumbens may be described as where the rubber meets the road with reinforcement. So you know that reinforcement involves mesolimbic dopamine or mesocortical dopamine. So when reinforcing stimuli occur, the reinforcement mechanism in the brain becomes active, and that helps to establish synaptic changes. The dopaminergic neurons, again, play an important role in reinforcement. So activity in the nucleus accumbens and dopamine released there are especially important for reinforcement. In terms of the functions of reinforcement, we detect the presence of a reinforcing stimulus. This depends a lot on one's physiological state. It's not necessarily automatic. There is a strengthening of connections between neurons that detect specific stimuli. So if a stimulus causes an appetitive behavior, then the stimulus can reinforce that behavior. Also, it's important to note that the prefrontal cortex, which isn't depicted in the cross sections here, provides important input to the ventral tegmental area. This increases the amount of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. It's involved in devising strategies, making plans, evaluating progress made towards goals, as well as judging the appropriateness of one's behavior. So now we're going to talk about the role of the cortex and the basal ganglia specifically in motor learning. By now you're pretty familiar with this diagram. What I want to do now is focus on the role of the cortex and the basal ganglia in motor learning. You know already that the basal ganglia plays an essential role in stimulus response and motor learning. From your reading, diseases of the basal ganglia, such as Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease, which we discussed in the movement unit, lead to difficulty in learning automatic responses as well, as you might imagine. With regard to the cortex, it's responsible for controlling the movements of the body. Several adjacent areas of the cortex are critical in organizing complex and learned movements. And improvement in motor learning occurs in between learning sessions and following sleep.